My Chinese Business, podcast number 11. Hi, today's podcast is another instance where I just got off the phone with my Chinese buddy and decided I had to get right on the microphone and start speaking of everything that we just had talked about. So it was kind of funny because we were talking about the chores we had to do today. And I mentioned how I had to do laundry, and she said she had to as well. And then she asked me what a laundry machine in English, how to say it. And I told her, washing machine. And then I asked her any other questions, because, if she had any other English questions, I wanted to help her out. We're friends. And she asked me, what is a dishwasher called? And I was like, well, it's called a dishwasher. And I asked her why she wanted to know that. Because in China, the entire time I was there, I never once went to a house where someone had a dishwasher. And another thing most people don't have there either that I actually never saw were ovens. I'd always see stoves and microwaves. That was it. That was all the heat and utensils in the kitchen. And this kind of surprised me because the more we talked about the utensils and the kitchen appliances, the more I started thinking about a conversation I had with one Chinese lady, and then because of that conversation, I started asking a couple, and I got the same results. And what that conversation was in China, I asked, what objects in the house, if you had those, people would consider you rich, 20, 30 years ago. And what brought this on originally was I had just bought a new bike, but this new bike was a used bike, because my other bike had been stolen, and that's kind of how things happen in Beijing. You get a bike, a couple months later it gets stolen, you buy another used bike, it gets stolen, and it's just a cycle. And I was riding this bike, and my buddy said, oh, that's the same bike my dad always wanted when he was growing up. And this bike was probably 20, 30, maybe even 40 years old, all steel. Forever was the name brand. And I said, really? A bicycle? Oh, it's because he was the only one of his buddies that didn't have one. And he said, no. Where he grew up in the town, only the richest person had a bicycle. No one else did. I was like thinking about how now people are just starting to get cars there. But back then, that would make sense. No one would even have a bicycle. So he was telling me how his father had always wanted a bicycle growing up. And I told this to someone else, and they agreed. They said, oh, yeah, my parents growing up never had bicycles. And, they just got a bicycle, when they got a job. And I asked them, I was like, what would be considered someone rich back then when your parents were growing up? And they all said the same thing, and it was if there's a refrigerator or, an ice machine in the house to keep things cold. That was it. That was a symbol of wealth for a lot of the families. And I asked this one lady about that, and she said, oh, yes, if someone had an ice machine in their apartment, that would be a good sign, that person was ready to get married, kind of like a symbol of wealth. And I asked them, now what is it? And they said, well, for a man to get married now, they should have an apartment and maybe a car. But an apartment's very important. And to me that sounded very materialistic. But the answer she gave me was, well, you need an apartment because it's very bad for children to move around a lot. And I asked some other people the same thing, and I said, what would be a very good thing for a man to have before he got married, or what would encourage a girl to want someone to get this one person to marry them? What would the material objects be? And they all say the same thing. Well, if they have an apartment, and whenever I say why, they say, well, because it's bad for children to move around a lot, or a child to move around a lot. Not that they're materialistic, but that's just how it should be. So right now, a guy should have an apartment, maybe a car. But just 20, 30 years ago, it was if there is an ice machine in the house. Granted, 20, 30 years ago, houses were supplied by the government, apartments and that, and things were a lot different. But that just kind of shows the change that has happened in China. And that's, one generation, more or less. So that's really impressive if you think about it. But then, of course, this also led into the conversation with people about, are they happier now or back then? And it's kind of odd because a lot of people I talked to actually said they were happier back then. And the reason why is because there wasn't as much pressure to have things. I mean, now to get married, you have to have a house, a car is good, but you have to have a lot of possessions before most women will even consider marrying you. And maybe not the girl, because maybe you grew up together in that, but her parents, they don't want their one child, or one of their two children, to marry someone that they don't feel could economically support their daughter and their child. So they really want a man with a good job, with a place to live, things like that. And that's, you could argue that's everywhere in the world, but when you're in China, you really kind of feel that. And that pressure, though, wasn't around not too long ago. And that does lead into the whole debate of what's going on right there, right now, in housing. Because a lot of people that I was talking to while I was there, they want the prices of houses to go down so they can afford it. They want to buy. To buy a house, in most places, they have to enter their name in a lottery. For that lottery, if they win, they can then buy an apartment maybe 5 years later. A side job for some of these people is to get the ticket to buy an apartment, but then sell the ticket to someone for a sum of money so that that other person can buy an apartment. And there's a lot of ways around someone having more than one residency, if the company owns it versus them. And there's a lot of interesting things going on in the housing in China. A lot of things there that a lot of people in the West don't realize. I mean, for example, right now it's very difficult for foreigners to have properties. They have to live there 1 year to have a property, and having multiple places. I mean, basically there's always a way around everything if you have money there. That's kind of a curse and a beauty of China. But what was I saying? Oh, I was going on about how if prices were to start to fall, there's a lot of laws that they could change in China, such as opening up housing to foreigners, allowing people to get second houses with a lower deposit. Right now, if you have a second apartment, you need a really large deposit on it. This one person I know, they got a second apartment, but the second apartment they had to put 40% deposit down on it. And there's just a lot of things that the government could change in China very quickly to keep the housing prices the same or raise it. But the population wants it lowered because they can't afford the house and they can't buy it, and they need that apartment before they can get married, or for many women to even consider them as a boyfriend or as a suitor. So I just brought all this up right now just because of that conversation that I had with my friend about what's a dishwasher in English? How do you say it in English? And when I told her the name, we started laughing because I'd never seen one there. She had never been to any place that had one. She just wanted to know that word. So it was very interesting. So it went from a word for an appliance they don't even use to talking about the culture and how it's changed and the material possessions a guy needs in order to become an eligible suitor, and how at one time people just a generation ago didn't even have bicycles growing up. Only the rich person in town may have had one, to now people needing an apartment and maybe even a car, and all this in just one generation, 1 to 2 generations. So the little bonus podcast for everyone. Hope everyone enjoyed it. And this is Shawn from My Chinese Business, and I will talk to everyone soon. Remember to visit my website, check out some videos on YouTube. I now have a YouTube channel, My Chinese Business, and I'll talk to everyone later. Take care. Bye.